Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Case For. I'm your host, Matt Campobasso. Before we jump in today, I want to take a moment and have a quick personal sidebar. So we're about 20 episodes into this podcast experiment at this point, and admittedly, I am still finding my voice. I am still tightening up the structure, learning about what works, what drags, what makes me want to throw my own outline into a river. But something's become more clear to me as this has gone on. The original motivation for starting this podcast was to use my legal training and experience to talk about topics that matter, topics that affect how we live, how we lead, and how we treat people. So if you're listening to this episode, you may notice it's a bit more structured, a little more courtroom-like, and I'm inserting a few more legal concepts, and that's intentional. I'm hoping to repeat this approach moving forward to keep this more in line with the idea that I had that prompted this podcast in the first place. That said, like all of us, this podcast is a work in progress, so please bear with me. And seriously, if you have feedback on how I can tighten things up or improve this content, please reach out. I'm all ears. All right. Today, we're going to put something under the microscope that shows up in all of our lives, whether we admit it or not. And that's outrage. It's not the kind of outrage that wakes you up to something real, but rather it's reactive or reflexive outrage, the kind where you read the first half of a headline and all of a sudden your blood pressure is up and you feel like you have the moral high ground. Today, I'm going to make the case for not letting outrage do your thinking, because outrage is great at mobilizing you, but really it's terrible at helping you make decisions on the merits. So let me start with something that I'm pretty confident you've lived through in the last few weeks. You wake up, you grab your phone, and a headline or a post punches you in the face. It doesn't inform you, it punches you. It's written like an emergency, a scandal, a betrayal. Somebody is clearly the villain, and you are clearly on the right side of history for being mad about it. And it's riddled with certainty. And you feel it in your body before you even finish reading. Your jaw tightens, your shoulders come up, your brain starts forming a closing argument with zero evidence in the record. And then later that day or the next, there's an update, and the update is quieter. It's not even a headline sometimes. It might be a paragraph or a clarification. It's more context emerged. The initial report didn't include X, Y, and Z, or it turns out that the clip that you saw that got you enraged started in the middle. And the funny thing is, that update often changes the entire meaning of what you thought happened. But guess what? The update isn't sexy. It doesn't trend. The update doesn't give you that same rush. So it mostly goes unnoticed. And meanwhile, the original version already did its job. It activated you. It recruited you. It sent you marching toward a verdict with confidence, like you've got jury instructions tattooed on your heart. That's headline whiplash. Before we go further, though, it's not just about news report headlines. It's about any and everything you might hear about. It can be a social media post. It can be a text message you receive. It can be a rumor you hear about somebody. And I'm going to tell you why this hits me so hard right now, especially as a dad. I have 3 kids, and I think about the world that we live in, a world where anything that they say or they do, anything that any of us say or do, can be captured, clipped, reposted, and preserved online forever. And I know, without question, that each of us is capable of having a moment that looks bad from the outside, a moment that we'd be ashamed of if it got stripped of context and broadcast to strangers. And I also know this: most people are a lot more complicated than a headline. Most situations aren't clean. They take time and kindness and curiosity to understand. So while outrage is easy, while it's quick, it's certain in the moment, understanding takes longer, but it leads to a softer world, a more livable one, and a world you would actually want your kids to grow up in. So on the topic of outrage, I want to bring in my past life experience for a second. I spent time as a prosecutor early in my career, and one thing courts are very intentional about is this. Judges remind juries clearly and repeatedly that the opening statements that are given are not evidence. They're statements. It's right there in the name. They're claims. It's an outline of what each side believes the evidence will show. But the evidence still has to be introduced. Witnesses have to testify. Exhibits have to come in. The burden has to be met. And if the evidence doesn't support the statement, then the judge will tell a jury not to treat it like truth. And in a criminal case, The system is built around this basic idea that feels almost quaint in a modern internet era. We don't rush to judgment because we're chasing certainty. We're chasing the truth, not the strongest opinion in the room, not the hottest take, but the truth. And that's why the process is deliberately slow. That's why both sides get to tell the story. That's why evidence has to be admitted rather than just asserted. That's why witnesses can be cross-examined, because the point isn't to see who can sound more convincing, it's to test what's real. It's also why, in a criminal trial, a defendant can testify on their own behalf if they choose to. They can tell their version of events, they can be questioned, their story can be weighed against other evidence. And the jury, usually 12 ordinary people, aren't there to vote on which narrative felt better emotionally. They're there for something much more disciplined. They're called the finders of fact. Their job isn't pick the story that you like. Their job is, has the party asking you to convict actually met the burden and proven that their story is true and accurate? I share all of that with you because I think those courtroom principles matter now more than ever, because the internet and the world we live in are basically one endless opening statement. And social media is full of a lot of people treating opening statements like verdicts. So here's my question to you. How often are you reacting like a juror who just heard an opening statement and immediately ran out of the courtroom to announce their verdict to the world? Because I think that's what we're dealing with right now. A world where the first version of a story can spike your blood pressure and the corrected version doesn't have a chance at getting your attention back. So here's my thesis. Outrage is a very powerful emotion, but it's a terrible decision maker. If you let outrage do your thinking, you become easy to manipulate, quick to villainize, and slow to correct because you entered a verdict without waiting for evidence. All right, that's the opening statement. That's my claim. Now we do what a real courtroom does next. We're going to build a record. We're going to walk through a series of exhibits, which are evidence that support the case that I'm making. And the point of those exhibits is simple. When they're all in, the record should support the verdict I'm asking you to enter. And as we do this, I want you to keep one idea in mind. This isn't about clean media literacy or doing your homework. It's about danger. Because outrage is not just an opinion. Outrage is a state. It's physiological. It changes what your brain prioritizes. It narrows your focus. It speeds you up. It makes you feel certain, even when you're not. Our first exhibit, Exhibit A, is the uncomfortable truth that outrage isn't just happening, it's actually being monetized. Not always maliciously, sometimes it's just being incentivized, but those incentives are obvious. Outrage gets clicks, it gets attention, it gets shares and comments. It keeps people glued to their screens like they're watching a courtroom drama where there's a new verdict on something every 5 minutes. And outrage is the cheapest fuel in the attention economy because it bypasses thought and it goes straight to emotion. And if you're wondering why headlines are getting sharper, or why language is getting more moralized, and why every story feels like it's trying to recruit you into a tribe, this is why. Outrage is not just emotion anymore, it's a product, and we're all customers. And here's why that matters. Because when something becomes a product, you're not consuming information, you're consuming a feeling, an experience designed to keep you coming back. To a news source, to someone's social media account, to build engagement, but it's all motivated by bringing people back again and again. So that reaction of outrage, it has a chemical signature. Your body gets a hit, your system lights up, you feel alert, you feel activated, you feel morally clear. In clarity, especially moral clarity, it feels amazing. It feels like purpose. It feels like certainty. It feels like you're on the right side. And that's why outrage is sticky. It doesn't just tell you what happened, it tells you who you are. And so with that, I'd like to move Exhibit A into evidence and move on to Exhibit B. Because once you see that outrage is being sold, the next question is, what exactly are we buying? Most of the time, we're not buying facts. We're buying framing. We're buying a version of events delivered with a built-in emotional conclusion. Exhibit B is about how the internet collapses that entire legal process into one step, an accusation, or an allegation as we call it in the law. If you've ever sat through a real trial, you know the pacing is slow for a good reason. The court will not let either side walk in, make a bold accusation, and say, great, we're done here. Courts require proof, procedure, standards. Online, we do the opposite. A headline drops, a clip gets posted, a screenshot circulates, and suddenly millions of people are emotionally convinced by what is basically an accusation. Not a record, not evidence, not cross-examined facts, just a statement. And the problem with statements is they can be true, they can be half true, or they can be true in a way that still produces a completely false conclusion, because the missing context is often the entire case. And this is where outrage makes things more dangerous. When you're outraged, you don't want more context. Context, that slows you down. It complicates the story, and it threatens your certainty. Outrage doesn't say, let's find out. Outrage says, I've seen enough. And that's how people get sloppy. They cut corners, they skip steps, they treat a caption like a transcript, they treat a clip like a record, they treat a vibe or a feeling like it's a verdict. And so with that, I'd like to move Exhibit B into evidence. And now all of that can feel abstract until you make it personal. So Exhibit C is a humility tool. It's something that can lower the temperature, a way to remember that you are also a human being who has absolutely had moments that would look terrible in the wrong frame. So Exhibit C is the mirror test. I want you to stop for a second and reflect on your own life. Have you ever had a moment, maybe a text message you sent, a tone you used, a comment you made, a split-second decision where you thought, if someone could see me right now in this moment, it would look bad? And maybe it would look bad out of context. But if you had 30 seconds to explain what happened right before it or right after it, what you meant by what you said, what you were carrying when that happened, or what you were reacting to, the entire temperature of the situation would come down. Not because you're perfect, but because context and evidence change meaning. So the next time you feel outrage rising, run your story through that lens. You are almost always seeing one person's framing of an event, one reporter, one poster, one account with incentives. You don't know what got cut. You don't know what happened before the clip started. You don't know what happened after. And you don't know the motivation behind the person who's sharing it. Are they there to inform you, to provoke you, to punish someone, to recruit? You just don't know. So the standard here shouldn't be, how quickly can I decide? The standard should be, can I give the benefit of the doubt that I would desperately want if I were the subject of the headline? And I'll say it plainly, because I do feel very strongly about this. I have an incredible disdain for how comfortable we've become reading something online and deciding we know everything that we need to know about a person or a situation or a motive, and then passing judgment like we're issuing a ruling. We need to get away from that. We need to return to curiosity. We need to treat human beings like human beings and ask questions. And if we don't have the energy or the time to do that, maybe we shouldn't enter a verdict in that situation. And with that, I'd like to move Exhibit C into evidence. Now, Exhibit D is about the why. Why is outrage so addictive? Why does it keep pulling us back? And why does it feel like clarity, even when it's making us careless? Because sometimes outrage isn't about justice. Sometimes it's about self-esteem. It's a way for the person who's feeling it to feel clean, aligned, better than somebody else, and like you're winning a morality contest. And if your life feels stressful, boring, uncertain, or out of control, outrage is a really quick way to feel powerful. It allows you to not have to fix your own life and to instead use that energy prosecuting someone else's. So yes, some outrage is appropriate. But also, some outrage is basically boredom wearing a moral badge. And here's the heavier point. Outrage is dangerous because it rewards you for being certain. It rewards you for being sharp. It rewards you for being quick. It gives you a hit of moral superiority that feels like fuel. And when something becomes fuel, you start reaching for it without realizing it. You start looking for villains because villains give you purpose. You start looking for gotchas because gotchas give you a rush. And all of that is completely counterproductive to understanding. Understanding requires patience. It requires nuance. It requires a willingness to be wrong. Outrage requires none of that. And with that, I'd like to move Exhibit D into evidence. And Exhibit E is the real-time detector, the thing you can run in your head before you type the comment, hit share, or mentally sentence a stranger to life in internet prison. Here's the tell. If a story makes you feel instantly righteous, it's probably manipulating you. Truth usually has a texture. Truth can handle questions. Truth doesn't need you sprinting into certainty. So here's a tool you can use in real time, and I call it the righteousness checklist. Next time you're feeling outrage bubbling up, ask yourself 3 questions. Do I feel instantly certain? Do I feel morally elevated? Or am I more interested in punishing than understanding? And if you answer yes to one or more of those questions, pause. Because the moment you feel righteous, your thinking gets cloudy. Righteousness feels like clarity, but it often produces careless certainty. And careless certainty is where people cut corners. They become sloppy. They share things they didn't verify. They assign motives they can't prove. They skip the part where facts get tested. And in the courtroom, we have a word for that. And that word is prejudgment. And with that, I'd like to move Exhibit E into evidence. All right, the exhibits are in, and that's the record. And if this were a real trial, opposing counsel wouldn't just sit there while I laid all of that out. They'd object. They'd jump out of their seat, waving their hands. They'd try to poke holes. They'd argue I'm being unrealistic or idealistic or too cautious or that outrage has a role. So let's do that. Let's pressure test the case I'm trying to make today. And yes, I recognize it's not exactly fair that I'm ruling on my own objections, but you do what you can with what you've got. Objection 1. But outrage is how we get accountability. And that's a strong objection. It's fair. There are real injustices. There's real harm. There are real stories that deserve immediate attention. Here's my response. Speed and accuracy are not the same thing. Accountability based on incomplete facts isn't accountability. It's roulette. And if you care about justice, like real justice, then you should care about evidence, context, and proportion. Pausing doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough to be correct. Outrage might be a good alarm bell, but it's a terrible judge. It's a terrible jury, and it's a terrible substitute for evidence. So I'm going to overrule that objection. Now, the second objection is usually the more confident one. It's the one that treats instinct like a legal standard. And that's that some stories are obvious, so you don't need to overthink them. Let's deal with that objection. First of all, that's a fair objection. Sometimes the facts are clear. Sometimes a pattern is clear. Sometimes the conclusion is obvious. But here's my response to that. Even when you end up being right, premature certainty makes you sloppy. And sloppy is how you spread something false. It's how you punish the wrong person, and it's how you become easy to manipulate. So yes, many cases are obvious, but the rule is still the rule. You shouldn't enter a verdict until you've actually seen the evidence. And that's why the courtroom is built the way it is. We require the party asking for a verdict to meet the burden. We allow cross-examination because claims need to be tested. We allow both sides to introduce evidence because one-sided stories are how you miss the truth. So I'm going to overrule that objection with a note. Some stories are obvious, but your confidence is not the legal standard. So now we've done what a real courtroom does. We set the theory in the opening statement, we've entered exhibits, we've taken on some objections, and we tested the weak spots, which means we're at the point where there's only one thing left, my closing argument. This is where we step back, put it all together, and we ask for a verdict. Ladies and gentlemen of the listening jury, we live in a world where every headline is trying to recruit you, not just into an opinion, but into an identity. And if you're not careful, you become a person who's always activated, always certain, always ready to condemn, which feels powerful in the moment until you realize you're not powerful. You're programmable. So I'm making a case for not letting outrage do your thinking, not because you shouldn't care, but because caring without discipline turns into cruelty, and because the internet is full of opening statements. You don't need to treat them like evidence. Wait for the evidence. And if there is none or not enough, don't enter a verdict. And now that you've heard the closing argument, I want to talk about how we apply these concepts practically. Here's the problem. In a courtroom, the system, the procedure, the judge, that creates space. That results in a pause. The judge enforces it. In real life, there's no judge. There's no jury instructions. There's just your phone and your nervous system and information that's streaming at you a million miles an hour. So if we want to live these ideas outside the courtroom, we're going to need a few simple habits that are small enough to use in the moment so that outrage doesn't ruin the whole show. Here's 4 tools that you can start using immediately. Tool number 1. The next time you see a headline that spikes you, say this out loud. Opening statement, not evidence. What does this mean? It means that it's interesting, maybe serious, worth tracking, but there's not enough that you know to convict. Because the internet wants you to treat every headline like it's a verdict. And I'm asking you to treat it like what it is, a claim. Tool number 2, the 90-second hold. When you see something, when you read something, don't post, don't comment, don't share, don't rush to the moral high ground. Just take 90 seconds and ask yourself, what do I know about this and what am I assuming? Because outrage loves speed. It loves impulsivity. So you don't fight outrage with a dissertation, you fight it with a pause. And in that pause, you give your brain a chance to catch up to your nervous system. Tool number 3, the second source rule. This one's big for lawyers because when you go to trial and you want to prove something, you don't want to just have one piece of evidence. You want to have as much evidence as you possibly can so that when you put it in front of a jury, they're overwhelmed by how certain you are in your case and they have no choice to find in your favor. So the idea here is I don't convict on one headline. So if you feel your finger hovering over the share button, ask yourself, do I have a second credible source here? Have I seen the full clip that this is based on? Have I read beyond the caption? If the answer to those questions is no, then I think it's pretty safe to conclude that you don't know enough to broadcast. That's not weakness, that's discipline. And the fourth tool is the mirror test. Ask yourself, if the worst 10 seconds of my day got posted without context, what would I beg people to consider? Because you'd want mercy and understanding. You'd want nuance. You'd want someone to stop on your behalf and say, hold on, what's the full story here? So extend the benefit of the doubt that you'd want to others before you sharpen the knife. All right, that's the toolkit. It's not never care, not stay quiet, not be indifferent. Just don't let the hottest feeling in the room be the smartest voice in your head or the loudest. Before you go, I want to leave you with a few things that I would love you to take away from this episode, because this episode is not asking you to care less. It's asking you to care better. Headline whiplash is real. The first version of a story, it lands like a grenade. The update lands like a feather. And Outrage loves first drafts because first drafts don't require evidence. They require a pulse and ideas. So here's the standard I think all of us could benefit from living by. Care fast, judge slow. Treat headlines like opening statements. And wait for the evidence. And if it doesn't come to you, go find it. And if you don't have time or energy to go find the evidence, set it down. Here's a humbling thought experiment, especially as a dad. If someone could screenshot the worst 10 seconds of your day, strip the context, post it with a dramatic caption, you'd want the world to pause. You'd want someone to say, hold on, what's the whole story here? So when outrage starts rising, run the mirror test. And remember this, when you see things with fire in your eyes, you might see something, but you're not going to see the whole truth. Fire makes things bright, but it also blinds you. And look, sometimes the story is really bad. Accountability is required. The evidence is overwhelming. But too many people are out there handing down life sentences based on opening statements and accusations. And I'm saying this as a former prosecutor. Even a court won't let you do that. So here's your mic drop rule. I want you to steal it. I want you to use it, put it on a Post-it or in your notes app. The next time your thumb hovers over share, imagine a judge looking over their glasses and saying, counselor, do you have any evidence? And if the answer is no, just sit down. Thanks for listening. And remember, whatever your case is, don't be afraid to build it and carry it out into the real world.